There is a small dented tin sitting on a shelf in a tool shed behind an old farmhouse outside Holmes County. It has no label. The lid does not quite seal anymore. Inside it is a soft, pale paste that cost about $3 to make from scratch, and it has outlived every spray can that has come and gone in that shed since the 1970s. The hand tools on the wall above it, the hinges on the barn door, the blades hanging from nails, all of them still show bare gray steel instead of orange flaking rust. Down the road, a hardware store sells a can of rust-proofing spray for $12 that has to be bought again every few months. A body shop in town charges close to $200 a year to undercoat a truck frame against the very same problem. That plain tin on the shelf does roughly the same job, for pennies, and it has done it for decades without a single advertisement. You already know the feeling this video is about, even if you have never put it into words. You buy a new shovel, and by the second summer there are orange freckles creeping across the blade. You leave a wrench out in the garage for one humid week, and it comes back stiff, spotted, harder to turn. You pay for a rust-proofing treatment when you buy a vehicle, and a few winters later the rocker panels are bubbling anyway. You spray the hinges, the chain, the mower deck, and a few months later you are spraying them again, because the can in your hand was never meant to be a permanent answer. It was meant to be a product you buy again. You assume this is just what owning metal things costs you. A little rust here, a little spray there, a little money leaking out every season. Maybe you have stood in the cleaning aisle holding two different rust removers, unsure which one actually works and which one is just better packaging. Maybe you have thrown away a perfectly good pair of pruning shears because the pivot rusted solid, and it seemed easier to buy new ones than to fight it. Most people never question any of this, because nobody ever showed them a different way to think about it. But there is a reason a certain kind of household, generations back, almost never had this problem. And it is not because they had better metal. It is because they understood something about rust that the spray can industry has very little reason to explain to you clearly. In many Amish and old rural farm communities, this was never an acceptable cost of doing business. A family that depended on its plow, its hand tools, its wagon hardware, and its kitchen knives could not afford to let half of them rust into uselessness every few years. There was no monthly subscription for rust prevention, no $12 can sitting on a shelf waiting to be repurchased. If a tool failed, the work did not get done, and there was no easy replacement waiting at a store 20 minutes away. So old farm households did something modern households mostly stopped doing. They paid attention to the metal itself, not to whatever was printed on the can that was supposed to protect it. They understood that rust was not bad luck. It was a chemical reaction, and chemical reactions can be interrupted if you understand what feeds them. This is the part most people get backwards from the very beginning. Most people think rust is something that simply happens to metal over time, the way a person gets gray hair, an unavoidable cost of aging. That is wrong, and it matters that it is wrong. Because believing it is unavoidable is exactly why people keep paying to fight it the hard way. Rust is not aging. Rust is a reaction. Bare iron or steel sitting in contact with oxygen and moisture at the same time will oxidize. And oxidized iron is what you are looking at when you see that orange flaking layer. Take away one of those two ingredients, oxygen or moisture, and the reaction has nothing to feed on. That is the whole principle hiding underneath every rust prevention product ever sold, expensive or cheap. The spray can in the hardware store is not doing anything mysterious. It is laying down a thin barrier so that air and water cannot reach the bare metal underneath. Once you understand that single idea, you stop needing the can to tell you what to do, because you can build the same barrier yourself, with cheaper materials and in some cases a barrier that lasts considerably longer. Old farm households built that barrier out of beeswax and oil because both of those things were already sitting in the house. Beeswax was nearly always on hand from keeping bees or trading with a neighbor who did. Oil was whatever the kitchen or the barn had in steady supply, often a plain mineral oil or a slow-curing oil like boiled linseed oil used for wood and leather. Melted together in the right ratio, beeswax and oil form a soft paste that soaks slightly into the surface of metal, then hardens into a thin, water-shedding film. It works on the same principle as a duck's feathers shedding rain, or a candle dripping wax that beads water rather than absorbing it. The wax is not fighting the water. It is simply refusing to let the water touch the metal at all. No moisture reaching the steel means no reaction, and no reaction means no rust, for as long as that barrier stays intact. Here is exactly how it is done, the way it was done on a kitchen stove rather than in a factory. You will need about 1 part beeswax to 2 or 3 parts oil, depending on how soft you want the final paste. A simple starting batch is 2 ounces of beeswax to 6 ounces of mineral oil, which costs somewhere around $3 to $5 depending on where you buy the wax, and makes far more paste than most households will use in a year. Buy plain beeswax pellets or a block of natural beeswax, not scented candle wax and not wax blended with paraffin, since paraffin alone does not hold up as well, and scented wax can leave a residue you do not want on tools you will be handling with bare hands. Mineral oil is sold cheaply at any pharmacy, and boiled linseed oil is sold at any hardware store. Either works, though boiled linseed oil cures harder over time and suits tools that get handled roughly, while mineral oil stays softer and suits items you will be wiping down and reapplying often, such as kitchen knives or garden shears. Melt the wax and oil together using a double boiler, never directly over an open flame, and never in a microwave, since wax can scorch and oil can splatter if it gets too hot too fast. A small saucepan of water with a metal can or jar set inside it works fine. Once the wax is fully melted into the oil and the mixture looks smooth and pale gold, pour it into a small tin or jar and let it cool until it firms into a soft, workable paste, similar in texture to a thick lip balm or a soft furniture wax. Before you apply it to anything, the metal itself needs to be clean and dry, and if there is already a layer of rust present, that rust needs to be scrubbed away first with steel wool or fine sandpaper, because the paste protects bare metal. It does not erase damage that has already happened. Apply a thin layer with a cloth or your fingers, working it into the surface. Then buff off the excess with a dry rag, the same way you would buff a shoe. You want a thin film, not a thick coating, because a thin film cures evenly, and a thick coating stays greasy and attracts dust and grit. For tools that sit in a shed or barn and only get handled occasionally, this treatment realistically holds up for 6 months to a year before it needs to be reapplied. For tools that get used daily, handled with sweaty hands, or left out in genuine weather, plan on touching it up every couple of months, the same way you would expect to reapply any protective coating that is doing real work. That is not a flaw in the method. That is simply how all barrier coatings behave, expensive or cheap, and any product claiming otherwise is not being honest with you. The difference is that reapplying this costs you 5 minutes and essentially nothing, instead of another $12 can. The most common mistake people make the first time they try this is applying it over metal that was not actually clean. Oil and wax will seal in dirt, grease, or existing rust just as easily as they seal out moisture. And if you trap moisture or rust underneath the layer, you have made the problem worse, not better, because now it is hidden instead of treated. The second common mistake is using too much at once. A heavy, gloppy coating never cures properly, stays tacky for weeks, and picks up dust like a flypaper. The third mistake, and probably the most dangerous one, is melting the wax over direct heat instead of a double boiler. Wax can ignite if it gets hot enough and catches a stray flame, the same general hazard as cooking with oil on a stove. Always melt it slowly, in a contained pot of water, in a space with good ventilation, and never walk away from it while it is on the heat. This is also where the method becomes useful for people who have never owned a barn or a plow in their life. The same paste that protects a hand tool works just as well on a cast iron skillet after it has been seasoned, on a bicycle chain that keeps squeaking after every rain, on garden shears, on the threads of outdoor bolts and hose bibs, on padlocks left outside a shed, and on door hinges that have started to seize. For knives and anything that touches food, use plain food-grade mineral oil rather than boiled linseed oil, and wipe the blade clean again before cutting, since the goal is a barrier against storage, not a coating left on something you are about to eat from. For outdoor hardware exposed to real weather, a slightly firmer mix with a touch more wax holds up longer between applications. The ratio is forgiving enough that you do not need to measure with great precision. What matters far more than the exact ratio is the habit of doing it at all, on a regular schedule. The way old households simply built it into the changing of the seasons, rather than treating it as an emergency response to rust that has already arrived. I want to be plain about the limits of this, because that matters more than the trick itself. This method protects metal that is already in reasonably good condition. It is not a repair for metal that is heavily pitted or already rusted through, and it will not bring a ruined tool back to full strength once the steel itself has been eaten away. It is not appropriate for engine parts that run hot, for exhaust components, or for anything that reaches high temperatures in regular use, since heat will simply melt and run off a wax-based coating. It is not a substitute for proper galvanizing on structural steel, fencing, or anything left permanently exposed to constant rain and sun for years at a stretch. If you are dealing with firearms, specialty machinery still under warranty, or equipment with a manufacturer's specific maintenance instructions, follow those instructions instead, since some manufacturers have reasons tied to specific alloys or coatings that a general household method should not override. And if rust has already compromised something structural, a railing, a vehicle frame, anything load-bearing, that is a question for a professional, not a kitchen paste. This trick buys you years on ordinary tools, hardware, blades, and hand equipment. It does not replace good judgment about safety-critical metal. Now ask yourself a simple question. If a $3 batch of wax and oil can protect a set of tools for most of a year, why does almost nobody know this, while an entire aisle of the hardware store is dedicated to rust spray, rust remover, rust converter, and rust-proofing service packages? The honest answer is not some hidden conspiracy meeting in a boardroom somewhere. The honest answer is much simpler and a little more uncomfortable. A can that needs to be bought again every few months is a better business than a paste made once from 2 ingredients you may already own. A repairable, refillable habit does not generate repeat sales the way a consumable product does. There is no advertising budget behind a method that costs almost nothing because there is no profit margin to fund the advertisement. Cheap, durable knowledge sitting quietly in a shed does not have a marketing department. A bright can on an end cap display does. There is no commercial that ends with a family gathered around a kitchen stove melting wax, because there is nothing to sell at the end of that scene. That is really the whole explanation. Nobody erased this on purpose. It simply never paid anyone to remind you it existed. There is a particular kind of kitchen table conversation that used to happen in farm households every fall, before the cold weather set in, when someone would melt down a batch of this paste on the stove, and the whole family would spend an evening wiping down hand tools, gate hinges, and kitchen knives while talking about the harvest. It was not treated as a chore worth complaining about. It was treated the way some people today treat changing the oil in a car, a small, routine act of keeping something you depend on working the way it should. A neighbor down the road might spend that same fall paying a shop to undercoat his truck, and both households would end up with metal that survived the winter. One of them spent close to $200 doing it. The other spent about $3 and an evening at the kitchen table. The lesson here is not that every old method beats every modern product. Some old methods disappeared because better solutions genuinely replaced them, and that is progress working the way it should. But some methods disappeared simply because they were too cheap and too simple to build a business around. And that is a different kind of disappearance entirely, one worth noticing. A $3 tin of wax and oil sitting quietly on a shelf in an old tool shed is not magic, and it will not fix everything that rust has already ruined. But it will quietly stop the next decade of rust from starting in the first place, on the tools and hardware that matter to you, for less money than a single tank of gas. Sometimes the past was not behind us at all. Sometimes it was simply waiting on a shelf for someone to look again. In the next video, we are going to look at another old farmhouse habit, one that most modern homeowners have never been taught, even though the materials for it may already be sitting somewhere in their own kitchen cabinet.